April 1998, White Sands Missile Range, New Mexico. The desert wind carried dust across the testing grounds as Colonel Marcus Webb watched the prototype vehicle roll into position. He was a career artilleryman with 22 years of service, a veteran of Desert Storm who had commanded M270 multiple launch rocket system batteries during the liberation of Kuwait. He understood artillery the way a surgeon understands anatomy, and what he saw parked before him made no sense. The vehicle looked like a delivery truck with a rocket pod strapped to its back. Where his beloved M270 rode on tank treads with armor protection, this thing sat on a standard 5-ton truck chassis. Where the M270 carried 2 rocket pods with 12 missiles, this carried 1 pod with 6. The entire system weighed barely 24,000 pounds compared to the M270's 55,000. Webb approached the Lockheed Martin engineer supervising the demonstration. "This is supposed to replace the MLRS?" The engineer, a soft-spoken man named David Chen, nodded. "The M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, HIMARS for short. We believe it represents the future of rocket artillery." Webb circled the vehicle slowly. Everything about it contradicted what he knew about artillery warfare. Since World War II, the doctrine had been clear. Artillery needed protection. Artillery needed firepower. Artillery needed to dominate through sheer destructive mass. The Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers of the Great Patriotic War had established the template. More rockets meant more destruction. Heavier systems meant more survivability. This HIMARS carried half the firepower of the M270 on an unarmored truck. It was the artillery equivalent of bringing a pistol to a tank battle. "With respect, Colonel, would you be willing to observe a live fire demonstration?" Chen asked. "The results might surprise you." Webb shrugged. He was a professional. Testing weapons was part of the job. Even weapons he knew were inadequate. "Let's see what this toy can do." They drove to the observation point overlooking the target range. 3 miles away, a cluster of decommissioned vehicles had been arranged to simulate an enemy command post. Chen explained the scenario while technicians prepared the launcher. The HIMARS crew consisted of only 3 soldiers: a driver, a gunner, and a section chief. Webb noted this with concern. His M270 crews had developed over years of training. Complex systems required complex crews. This skeleton team seemed woefully inadequate for precision artillery work. At 0900, Chen gave the order to commence firing. What happened next would stay with Webb for the rest of his career. The HIMARS rolled from its concealed position behind a rock formation. Within 90 seconds of receiving the fire mission, the launcher had positioned itself, elevated its pod, and began firing. 6 rockets screamed into the sky in rapid succession, their trails converging on the distant target. Webb watched through high-powered binoculars. The rockets struck with devastating precision. Not in a scattered pattern like traditional artillery, not blanketing an area with suppressive fire. Each rocket impacted within meters of its designated aim point. The command post vehicles erupted in sequence, destroyed individually rather than collectively. Before the last explosions faded, the HIMARS was already moving. The entire engagement from arrival to departure had taken less than 5 minutes. Webb lowered his binoculars slowly. "That's not possible. That level of accuracy from rocket artillery. It's not possible." Chen smiled slightly. GPS guidance combined with inertial navigation. Each rocket knows exactly where it is and exactly where it's going. The circular error probable is under 10 meters at maximum range. Webb understood the implications immediately. Traditional rocket artillery was an area weapon. You fired salvos at general locations hoping to hit something. The mathematics were simple. More rockets equaled higher probability of destruction. But if each rocket could hit a precise point, the equation changed entirely. "Run it again," Webb said. "I need to verify this." They conducted 12 more fire missions over the following 3 days. The results were consistent. The HIMARS achieved accuracy that the M270 couldn't match even with its advanced variants. More importantly, the speed of engagement was revolutionary. Traditional artillery doctrine required elaborate fire direction calculations, survey teams to establish precise positions, and lengthy setup procedures. The HIMARS eliminated all of that. Its onboard computer received target coordinates, calculated the firing solution, and executed the mission in minutes. A single HIMARS could engage more targets per hour than an entire M270 battery. But what truly changed Webb's understanding was the mobility demonstration on the 4th day. Chen had arranged a scenario simulating counter-battery fire. In modern warfare, the moment you fire artillery, enemy sensors detect your position. Counter-battery radar tracks the trajectory of your rounds backward to identify the launch point. Then enemy artillery returns fire, destroying your weapons before they can fire again. This was the fundamental vulnerability of artillery. Shoot, and you reveal yourself. Reveal yourself, and you die. The scenario gave the HIMARS a simulated enemy response time of 8 minutes from detection to counterfire. This was generous. Russian counter-battery systems could respond in as little as 5. The HIMARS received its fire mission at a random location, drove to firing position, launched its rockets, and displaced to a new location. The entire cycle took 4 minutes and 30 seconds. By the time simulated enemy rounds would have impacted the firing position, the HIMARS was 2 kilometers away and accelerating. They ran the scenario 15 times. The HIMARS escaped every simulated counter-battery engagement. "This changes everything," Webb admitted to Chen on the final evening. "The speed, the accuracy, the survivability. This isn't just a lighter MLRS. It's a completely different weapon system." Chen nodded. "That's what we've been trying to explain. The HIMARS isn't designed to replace the M270 in its traditional role. It's designed to operate in ways the M270 never could. Rapid deployment, precision strike, shoot and scoot. This is artillery for a new era of warfare." Webb compiled his evaluation report with unusual care. He detailed the accuracy testing, the mobility demonstrations, the revolutionary fire control system. He argued that HIMARS represented a paradigm shift in artillery doctrine. The emphasis should move from mass destruction to precision effects, from static positions to constant movement, from overwhelming firepower to surgical strikes. His recommendation was unambiguous. Adopt HIMARS immediately. Train crews extensively. Develop new doctrine to exploit its capabilities. The report went up the chain of command and encountered resistance at every level. Brigadier General Harold Foster had commanded artillery in Desert Storm. He had watched MLRS batteries devastate Iraqi positions with salvos of hundreds of rockets. He had seen the terror that massed rocket fire inflicted on enemy troops. He understood artillery as hammer, not scalpel. Foster read Webb's report with growing irritation. "Colonel, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're missing the fundamental point. Artillery wins battles through suppression and destruction. You suppress the enemy with volume of fire, then you destroy him with concentrated effects. This HIMARS can't do either. Sir, the precision changes the equation. One accurate round achieves what dozens of inaccurate rounds cannot." Foster shook his head. "Theory. In combat, you need volume. You need to saturate an area because you never know exactly where the enemy is. You need sustained fire to keep heads down. One launcher with 6 rockets can't provide suppression. It's a one-shot weapon in a sustained fire war. The accuracy allows you to hit specific high-value targets. command posts, ammunition depots, air defense radars. You don't need suppression if you can decapitate enemy command and control. Foster's expression hardened. Colonel, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've seen wonder weapons come and go. They all promise revolutionary change. They all fail when they meet reality. War is chaos. War is confusion. War is fog and friction. Precision weapons assume you know where the target is. In my experience, you rarely do. The evaluation continued for 2 more years. Supporters argued for HIMARS based on its documented capabilities. Opponents countered with doctrinal concerns and institutional resistance. The debate became political, with careers and budgets at stake. In December 1999, the Army awarded Lockheed Martin a contract for engineering and manufacturing development. But the contract was modest: 6 launchers for extended evaluation. The Army remained unconvinced that HIMARS represented more than a niche capability. Colonel Webb, now retired, watched the program struggle with frustration. The weapon was revolutionary. The testing had proven its capabilities. But the institution couldn't accept change that contradicted decades of doctrine. Then came September 11, 2001. The attacks on New York and Washington transformed American military thinking overnight. The new enemy wasn't a conventional army with fixed positions and predictable doctrine. It was a dispersed network of terrorists operating from remote locations in failed states. Afghanistan became the first battleground. Operation Enduring Freedom presented artillery challenges that conventional systems couldn't solve. The terrain was mountainous, with limited roads and vast distances. Enemy fighters moved constantly, appearing briefly to attack, then vanishing into the landscape. Traditional artillery required extensive logistics. Moving M270 batteries through Afghan terrain was essentially impossible. In 2005, the first HIMARS battery deployed to Afghanistan with the 27th Field Artillery Regiment. What they discovered validated everything the original testing had suggested. The HIMARS could be transported by C-130 aircraft, allowing rapid deployment to remote forward operating bases where heavier systems couldn't reach. A single launcher could provide fire support across enormous areas because of its mobility. The precision guidance allowed engagement of small targets like individual buildings where enemy fighters were identified. But the true revelation was the speed of response. In Afghanistan, enemy contacts were fleeting. Taliban fighters might be visible for minutes before disappearing. Traditional artillery support took 20 minutes or more to coordinate. By the time rounds arrived, the enemy was gone. HIMARS changed that equation. With targets identified by ground forces or aerial surveillance, HIMARS crews could receive coordinates, move to firing position, launch, and displace in under 5 minutes. Targets that would have escaped under traditional doctrine were now engageable. On May 24, 2018, a HIMARS unit received intelligence that 50 Taliban fighters had gathered in a building in Musa Qala. The target was identified at 0847. At 0851, 3 GMLRS rockets struck the building, killing all 50 fighters. The engagement from identification to destruction had taken 4 minutes. By the time American forces withdrew from Afghanistan, HIMARS units had logged over 1 million operational hours with a 99% readiness rate. The weapon that senior officers had dismissed as a toy had proven itself the most effective precision fire system in the theater. But Afghanistan was a counterinsurgency fight against an enemy without sophisticated weapons. The question remained whether HIMARS could perform against a peer adversary with modern air defenses, electronic warfare, and counter-battery capabilities. February 24, 2022 provided the answer. When Russian forces invaded Ukraine, Most Western analysts expected a rapid Ukrainian collapse. Russia possessed overwhelming numerical superiority in artillery. Soviet doctrine had always emphasized massed fires, and modern Russian forces inherited thousands of howitzers, rocket launchers, and tactical missiles. Ukrainian artillery was outgunned perhaps 10-1. For 4 months, the Russians exploited this advantage brutally. Their artillery devastated Ukrainian positions with continuous bombardment. Cities were reduced to rubble. Ukrainian units suffered catastrophic casualties from shelling they couldn't effectively counter. Ukraine pleaded for Western artillery support. NATO countries provided howitzers and ammunition. These helped but couldn't change the fundamental dynamic. The Ukrainians remained outgunned. Then, on June 1, 2022, the United States announced it would send 4 HIMARS launchers to Ukraine. Russian military commentators dismissed the announcement. 4 launchers against thousands of Russian artillery pieces? It was a meaningless gesture, symbolic support rather than substantive military aid. The first HIMARS arrived in Ukraine in late June. Ukrainian crews had trained on the systems for only 3 weeks. American advisors were skeptical that such brief training could produce effective crews. On July 11, 2022, Ukrainian forces launched their first HIMARS strike. The target was a Russian ammunition depot in Nova Kakhovka, located in occupied Kherson region, approximately 55 kilometers behind Russian lines. The depot contained thousands of artillery rounds, rocket ammunition, and explosives accumulated to support Russian offensive operations. At approximately 0100, GMLRS rockets struck the depot with devastating precision. The initial impacts detonated the stored ammunition, triggering secondary explosions that continued for hours. Satellite imagery captured the moment. A warehouse that had contained enough ammunition to support weeks of Russian artillery operations simply ceased to exist. The explosion was so powerful that it overloaded sensors on NASA satellites. Russian sources reported at least 7 killed and 70 wounded. Ukrainian intelligence suggested the true casualties were much higher. 1 strike, 4 rockets, an entire ammunition depot destroyed. Within a week, Ukrainian HIMARS had struck over a dozen similar targets. Russian ammunition depots throughout occupied territory erupted in flames. Command posts were hit. Air defense radars were destroyed. A Russian general was killed when rockets struck his headquarters. Russian military bloggers, previously dismissive, became alarmed. One prominent commentator called the Nova Kakhovka strike one of the most serious blows of all time. Igor Girkin, a former Russian intelligence officer who had commanded separatist forces in eastern Ukraine in 2014, acknowledged that Russian air defense systems were proving ineffective against the precision strikes. The mathematics were devastating for Russia. Each GMLRS rocket cost approximately $160,000. Each Russian ammunition depot contained tens of millions of dollars worth of munitions. Each Russian command post disrupted operations across an entire sector. The exchange ratio was catastrophically unfavorable to Russia. More critically, the HIMARS were unhittable. Russian doctrine emphasized counter-battery fire. Their radar systems could track rocket launches and calculate firing positions. Their own rocket artillery could respond within minutes. This should have made HIMARS launchers vulnerable. But the Ukrainian crews had mastered the shoot-and-scoot tactic with remarkable speed. A HIMARS would move from concealment, fire its rockets in under 60 seconds, and displace immediately. By the time Russian counter-battery systems processed the launch data and coordinated a response, the launcher was kilometers away. Russia claimed repeatedly to have destroyed Ukrainian HIMARS. Their defense ministry announced the destruction of more HIMARS than had ever been delivered to Ukraine. But they couldn't provide evidence. No photographs, No video, no satellite imagery. The claims were propaganda, contradicted by the continuous strikes that kept coming. Western military analysts were astonished. 8 HIMARS launchers, operated by crews with minimal training, were achieving effects that entire artillery brigades couldn't match. The precision advantage was so decisive that it compensated for overwhelming Russian numerical superiority. Senior Ukrainian military officials began reporting that the HIMARS had fundamentally changed their operational calculus. Previously, Russian logistics had operated with impunity well behind the front lines. Ammunition depots, fuel storage, repair facilities all functioned safely beyond the range of Ukrainian artillery. Now, nothing within 80 kilometers of Ukrainian positions was safe. Russia was forced to move its logistics further back. This created cascading problems. Longer supply lines meant more trucks needed. More trucks meant more fuel consumption. More fuel consumption meant more logistics requirements. The vicious cycle degraded Russian offensive capability. By late July, Western analysts observed a dramatic decrease in Russian artillery fire rates, not because Russia lacked ammunition at the strategic level, but because they couldn't get it to the guns. The HIMARS had interdicted their supply chain. On September 6, 2022, Ukraine launched a surprise counteroffensive in Kharkiv region. Within days, they had liberated thousands of square kilometers, routing Russian forces who couldn't coordinate defense because their command posts and logistics had been systematically destroyed. The HIMARS had made the counteroffensive possible. Ukraine continued requesting more HIMARS and more ammunition. The United States steadily increased deliveries. By year's end, Ukraine had received 16 launchers. The strikes continued unabated. But Ukraine also wanted something more. The GMLRS rockets had a range of approximately 80 kilometers. This was sufficient to hit tactical targets behind Russian lines. But higher-value targets lay deeper. Russian airfields where attack helicopters based, naval facilities in Crimea, strategic command centers. Ukraine wanted ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, a larger missile that could be fired from HIMARS launchers with a range of up to 300 kilometers. The United States initially refused. Officials expressed concern that Ukraine might use the missiles to strike targets inside Russia, potentially escalating the conflict. Ukraine insisted they would use ATACMS only against legitimate military targets in occupied Ukrainian territory. The debate continued through 2023. Ukraine kept asking. America kept refusing. Russian forces remained vulnerable but just beyond reach. Then, in October 2023, the equation changed. On the night of October 17, Ukrainian forces launched a strike against Russian military airfields in occupied Berdyansk and Luhansk. The targets were located approximately 100 kilometers from Ukrainian positions, well beyond the range of GMLRS rockets. The results were devastating. At Berdyansk airfield, multiple Ka-52 attack helicopters were caught on the ground. The precision strikes hit exactly where the helicopters were parked. 9 helicopters were destroyed in minutes. An air defense radar installation was eliminated. An ammunition warehouse erupted in flames. Runway facilities were damaged. The strike destroyed approximately 11% of Russia's entire pre-war Ka-52 fleet in a single night. Russian military bloggers confirmed the attack's effectiveness. One described it as possibly the most serious blow of the entire war. Satellite imagery showed the devastation. Where helicopters had been parked, only scorched pavement remained. The missiles were ATACMS. The United States had secretly provided approximately 20 of the older variant missiles with 165-kilometer range. Ukraine had used them with characteristic precision. Russian forces were stunned. They had believed their airfields were beyond Ukrainian reach. They had concentrated valuable aviation assets at bases they assumed were safe. They had been catastrophically wrong. The implications rippled through Russian military planning. If 165-kilometer range ATACMS could reach Berdyansk, what else was vulnerable? Airfields throughout occupied territory, naval bases in Crimea, strategic installations that had operated with impunity since 2014. Russia began dispersing aircraft. Moving helicopters further back meant longer flight times to the front. Longer flight times meant reduced sortie rates. Reduced sortie rates meant less air support for ground forces. The ATACMS hadn't just destroyed helicopters. It had degraded Russian air operations across the entire theater. Ukraine pressed for more. In spring 2024, the United States provided longer-range ATACMS variants with 300-kilometer reach. Ukraine used them to strike air defense installations across Crimea, degrading the protective umbrella that had shielded Russian forces on the peninsula. The pattern was consistent. Each capability increase generated disproportionate effects. Each target category that became vulnerable forced Russian operational adjustments that cascaded through their entire force structure. But Russia was adapting. Their electronic warfare capabilities, always formidable, began targeting the GPS guidance systems that made HIMARS so precise. Reports emerged in mid-2023 that Russian jamming was affecting GMLRS accuracy. The rockets used GPS for precision guidance, with inertial navigation as backup. When GPS signals were jammed or spoofed, accuracy degraded significantly. Congressional testimony revealed that the Excalibur GPS-guided artillery round, another precision weapon provided to Ukraine, had seen its effectiveness drop from 70% to 6% as Russian electronic warfare adapted. The GMLRS faced similar challenges. Some rockets were landing 50 feet or more from their intended targets. Against point targets like individual vehicles or buildings, such errors could mean complete misses. American engineers worked with Ukrainian forces to develop countermeasures. Software updates to counter specific jamming techniques, operational adjustments to fire from positions less affected by electronic warfare, integration of alternative navigation systems. The cat-and-mouse game continues. Russia deploys new jamming systems. Ukraine and America develop counters. The technological competition evolves with each engagement. Yet despite the electronic warfare challenges, HIMARS remains one of Ukraine's most effective weapons. The fundamental advantages of mobility, precision, and rapid engagement persist even when degraded by jamming. A rocket landing 50 feet from its target is still far more accurate than traditional artillery landing 500 feet away. As of late 2024, Ukraine has received 39 HIMARS launchers. They have conducted thousands of strikes against Russian targets. At least 4 launchers have been destroyed by Russian forces, proving that the systems are not invulnerable. But the exchange ratio remains massively favorable to Ukraine. Russian forces have learned to fear the HIMARS. They disperse their logistics rather than concentrating supplies. They move command posts frequently. They avoid massing forces within range of Ukrainian launchers. These adaptations reduce their own effectiveness while failing to neutralize the Ukrainian advantage. The weapon that senior American officers dismissed as inadequate in 1998 has become the most feared precision strike system on the modern battlefield. The doctrine that emphasized mass destruction has given way to surgical precision. The assumption that artillery required heavy protection has been replaced by understanding that mobility provides better survivability than armor. Colonel Webb, now long retired, has watched the Ukrainian conflict with particular attention. In interviews, he has been blunt about the lessons. Everything we saw in testing in 1998 has been validated in Ukraine. The precision, the mobility, the ability to achieve decisive effects with minimal ammunition expenditure. We could have had this capability 20 years earlier if the institution had been willing to challenge its assumptions. The HIMARS story parallels other military innovations that faced institutional resistance before proving their value in combat. The aircraft carrier was dismissed by battleship admirals until Pearl Harbor. The tank was rejected by cavalry officers until Blitzkrieg. Precision-guided weapons were considered unreliable until Desert Storm demonstrated their revolutionary potential. In each case, new technology offered capabilities that contradicted established doctrine. In each case, institutional resistance delayed adoption. In each case, combat eventually proved what testing had shown. The new approach worked better than the old. Russia has learned this lesson at enormous cost. Their ammunition depots have burned. Their command posts have been destroyed. Their generals have been killed. Their air operations have been degraded. All because a handful of truck-mounted rocket launchers achieved effects that their thousands of artillery pieces could not counter. The Russian military had studied American artillery doctrine for decades. They understood MLRS capabilities. They had developed counters to massed rocket fire. What they never anticipated was that America would develop something fundamentally different. A system that valued precision over volume, mobility over protection, surgical effects over area destruction. They never knew that their own assumptions about artillery warfare would prove as obsolete as cavalry charges against machine guns. The HIMARS continues to evolve. Lockheed Martin has developed extended-range GMLRS rockets that double the reach of standard ammunition. The Precision Strike Missile, intended to replace ATACMS, offers ranges exceeding 500 kilometers with enhanced accuracy. Future variants may incorporate anti-ship capabilities, autonomous targeting, or counter-battery functions. Each evolution makes the weapon more dangerous to potential adversaries. Each capability increase renders previous assumptions about safe distances obsolete. The institution that once resisted HIMARS now cannot produce them fast enough to meet global demand. Poland has ordered 500 launchers. Romania, the Baltic states, and Australia have all purchased systems. NATO members who watched Ukraine's success have concluded that HIMARS represents the future of artillery warfare. The Russian military learned what the American military almost forgot. Weapons designed for the last war often fail in the next one. Doctrine must evolve with technology. Assumptions must be tested against evidence, and sometimes a system that looks like a toy turns out to be the most lethal weapon on the battlefield. General Foster, who dismissed HIMARS in 1998, passed away in 2019. He never saw the Ukrainian conflict. He never watched Russian ammunition depots explode under precision strikes. He never learned that the weapon he rejected would reshape modern warfare. His skepticism was genuine. His concerns were reasonable based on his experience. He had seen artillery warfare in Desert Storm. He understood what massed rocket fire could achieve. What he couldn't imagine was a different kind of artillery, one that traded volume for precision, mass for mobility, destruction for disruption. The soldiers who first mocked HIMARS as a delivery truck with rockets strapped on learned to respect what it could do. The officers who questioned its utility watched it achieve effects they thought impossible. The institution that resisted its adoption now considers it indispensable. This is how military revolutions happen, not through sudden transformation, through gradual accumulation of evidence that eventually overwhelms institutional resistance, through testing that proves capability, through combat that validates testing, through success that cannot be denied. The Russian engineers who designed their counter-battery systems never knew those systems would prove helpless against shoot-and-scoot tactics. The Russian commanders who positioned their ammunition depots never knew those positions would become death traps. The Russian strategists who assumed their numerical artillery superiority would prove decisive never knew that precision would trump volume. They never knew, and that ignorance cost them dearly. If you found this story of innovation overcoming tradition compelling, subscribe to explore more moments when assumptions crumbled against evidence, when the dismissed became the dominant, when the courage to test new ideas honestly changed the course of history. Like and subscribe, because understanding how military technology evolves helps us understand how the future of conflict will be shaped by those willing to challenge what everyone knows to be true.